welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. My name is Jessica. I am one of your hosts today. I am sitting here with another wonderful librarian host. Who are you?
My name is Kaye, and I'm part of the Reader Services Department of the library here at Syosset Library, and I'm here to recommend books, pretty much.
Yeah, and we're here with an awesome author. Please introduce yourself and tell us about the Archive Undying.
Hi, thank you for having me. Delighted to be here. We're already chit-chatting before we started recording, so I'm excited about this. My name is Emma Mieko Candon. I wrote both Star Wars Ronin and the book that's just around the bend, may be out by the time this comes out, is The Archive Undying. And it's been called mecha fiction, it's been called AI fiction, it's been called queer fiction, it's all of these things. I sometimes call it fantasy dressed up with sci-fi terminology. It's kind of in some weird little junctions of various kinds of genre stuff, but that's just what makes me happy. So yeah, that's the book.
And that's actually funny. So as I was reading your book, it's so funny that you say that it's like fantasy with that sci-fi wrapping around it, because that is kind of what Star Wars is like. And that's
totally 100%. Yeah, 100%.
And that is where your first book was of Star Wars extended universe book. So what was the difference between writing a book in an established universe like Star Wars as opposed to making something up like you did with the Archive Undying?
So this is I can actually talk about this pretty in depth because there's an interesting the timeline is fascinating. So we had gone out on submission with the Archive Undying at the end of 2020, and I signed the contract for that basically a month almost exactly before I got the offer for the Star Wars book. So I had written that first, and part of the stuff in my mind when I was writing Archive was all right, make this your thesis statement for why you should get to write a Star Wars book one day. And I guess it worked. But Ronin came together super fast, which is, I think in retrospect, a lot to do with a variety of guardrails that were in place, both in terms I made up that story. I made up that plot pretty much from whole cloth. However, I was given a very solid opening with the short that it's extended from. And I was also given some very strong thematic guardrails, both in the fact that the entire point of the Visions project, which Ronin is part of, is iterating on Star Wars. So you have that mythology to work with and work from. And I was also bringing in the key aesthetic and historical notes that the specific short, The Duel, was working from. And it's very much in the style of what you would recognize as jidaigeki or period pieces, which a lot of Western audiences will recognize through Kurosawa, who's internationally famous. But those auteurs were working in the aftermath of World War II. And that's actually, art in that period is something I'm actually pretty familiar with academically. So I was drawing a lot from that somewhat naturally. And I was also thinking a little bit about my own family history, because at the time of World War II, my family was Japanese American on both sides, and they had a wild range of experiences, because on one side, my great grandpa was one of the few Japanese Americans in Hawaii who was interned. And then on the other side, the man who was going to marry his eldest daughter in a few years ended up joining the army as a translator. So essentially he was working for, the CIA and spies translating Japanese intel. And So like there's just a lot of complicated stuff going on there that I was thinking about with Ronin, but it was all very like it was informing the space the story could take up. And when I move over into my own fiction, I don't have those guardrails. The guardrails are whatever I decide they're going to be. And in that way, it gets a lot messier. And I have to forge those first before I can work with any kind of speed. So like right now, I'm working on the second book that follows up to The Archive Undying. And it's been a trial and a half, in part because I wrote Archive Undying to function as a standalone if it had to. But I signed a 2-book deal, so that meant there was going to be another one. And what I initially thought was going to be the second book was not, in part because of that standalone stuff where I'd kind of wrapped up a lot of the emotional issues I thought I would have potentially tackled. I realized, oh, wait, those were actually kind of addressed. So you're going to have to evolve them if you're going to write an actual, like, meaningful book about it. But yeah, so that's what I would say has been the main difference. Is just that like when you are working with IP, regardless of whether they give you like specific story beats they want you to hit or whether you have freedom, you are working within the space of a particular mythology. And in my case, I also had some very specific aesthetic and historical boundaries.
So yeah, I have to ask a little bit about, just like the world that you built. And, I want to talk, Kaye had mentioned, we were talking a little bit about the whole chat. What is it?
Oh, Chat GPT. I read an interview that you did before where you talked a little bit about Chat GPT and how it was dumb AI. And I don't think that was the exact wording you used. So excuse
I
me.
mean, like that's it, you are correct.
Okay, yeah, I
It's-
agree. I agree with what I'm saying. Yes,
yeah.
I have a lot of friends who are like deeply interested in AI, and so reading this book was really fascinating for me because I was kind of like, this is what we could have, where like you could have an AI who's running a city, who's built a city, who's like the heart of this place. And yes, it has disastrous consequences, which we see in the book when the AI dies and they take the city with them, which I think is insane and amazing, insane in a good way. But like we have AI who, like, not to get too controversial, but the AI that we're building right now is not doing anything to improve society. It's just stealing art and regurgitating text back at us. And so I loved that in your interview you were like, yeah, Chat GPT is dumb. And I think you said something about you were working on your master's degree at the time.
Yeah, so I did a master's in clinical psychology, and so back in and that I started that in 2014, finished it out in 2016, and I date that because at the time they were having a lot, like somewhere I was reading a lot of discussions on machine learning. I don't really know why I had gotten really into that. I can't trace the trajectory. When I was telling my friends at the time, like, yeah, I've gotten really into AI stuff, I'm really curious about it. They all treated that as a given, and I thought it was like a new interest, so it must have been predated in something. But so like what I learned at the time was like one that we were building these really sophisticated algorithms, which you're seeing come into like public contact now with Midjourney and the other image generators, and also with ChatGPT and the other like text generators. And the thing is, like, they barely qualify to be called AI. Like, arguably, they shouldn't. Other people would say, arguably, yes, they should, because when you use the term AI, you evoke a fantasy, but concretely, this is what AI is in our context today. And other people would say, well, then why are you calling it AI if it's nothing like the thing that we imagined AI would be? Like, it's just a generator based on a highly sophisticated algorithm, but like it's algorithmic. And the thing that I was thinking about when I was reading all this literature, almost 10 years ago, was like, well, I kind of agree that I don't know that the word AI really applies here, because I'm spending all this time learning about how brains function, not just socially, but like physically, because right now the models of psychology that are popular are really deeply intertwined with understanding how we work biologically. So it's not just psychoanalysis and just like the theory of thought, which can get like almost metaphysical and not really like grounded in anything, which I think is still important to a degree, because I was really skeptical of it for a while, but I've gotten to the point where I don't think that you can really treat a human being by just treating them like a set of biological impulses. I don't think it really works. It has to all be in concert with each other. And that is what is fundamentally popular in the study of psychology right now, like that integrated approach. But because of that integrated approach, I had to like get familiar with the fundamental basics of neurology. And even understanding the fundamental basics, I realized, oh, these things that they're calling AI don't think. They don't. They are incapable of thought. Like, and also understood, in the way that anybody who is beginning to grasp even a little bit of expertise in a field, one of those first things you understand is how little you understand, and also how little the entire field understands. And so standing on the brink of human intelligence and going, oh my God, we understand so little about this, and looking at people who have like this very basic hubristic understanding of, yeah, we can build artificial intelligence. It's like, no, you can't. We don't even understand how regular intelligence works. So when I started writing this book, which was in the immediate aftermath of this degree, I was trying to talk about artificial intelligence in a way that was really deeply aligned with my understanding of how brains actually function, which is, again, very physical and also very emotive, because cognition is built on emotion, and that is informed both by our biology and also by our social connections, which are themselves like biologically intertwined. It's all a mess, it's all interconnected. But when I built these AIs, they had to be entities that were feeling and that had feelings about other entities. So yeah, that's the basis of all like AI bullshit in the Archive Undying.
That's so funny. I used to like teach people how to like be on a computer a long time ago.
Oh, yeah.
And people would always be like, the computer is smarter than I am. And I'd have to tell them, it's very similar to what we were just talking about, that like, no, a computer is only as smart as the person sitting in front of it. And I think that's very true about what we're seeing in AI and also like generated brains online, basically, is that it's only as smart as the people who are building the algorithm. It's only as smart as the information that you're feeding into it. And I do think the AI that you have in your story are very different. And I love that you've like kind of evolved them into like almost gods in this world that you've made. But I did want to ask specifically about them. Where did you come up with the names for your AI? Because I loved saying them out loud. Like they roll off the tongue, so iterate fractal. I was like, I love saying that. Something about saying that makes me happy. I don't know, maybe it's just like a
I was just about to say, like, when you say it, it's like your mouth is automatically in a smile. It's
Okay, so that's two things. One of which is that I love words, and so I like collect them. And two of which is there's this like developing trend, I think, all through speculative fiction, where people are getting more comfortable using like just words as names. And I love that. Like when I started seeing that happen, I was like, oh God, yeah, me too. And third, there is a particular podcast, which is, I think, the master of this art. And I had been listening to one of their seasons of story right before I started writing the Archive Undying. And it's an actual play podcast. So it's like one of those where they play a tabletop RPG. So like the more famous ones these days are like Critical Role, Dimension 20. These guys are friends at the table. I adore them. I think I've pitched them in almost everything I've talked to about this book, because like they were fundamental to part of how I was thinking about things at the time. And they come up with the best goddamn names, like bar none. But it's things like they had this side character in one of their scenes who was named like Public Person. Like, are you kidding me? That's amazing. um but yeah, like there's another character who's named Grand Magnificent, another who's like 1415, Tender Sky, like Echo Reverie. It's incredible. But like I was, feeding off of their brains at the point when I was like coming up with stuff. And another element here is I don't like coming up with fantasy names. I'm not very good at it. It's very hard for me. In fact, every character in the Archive Undying has had at least 3 different names over the course of me writing it, because as soon as something becomes like not quite right, I'll just ditch it because I don't care. But these names that were built on English language, I got to keep because they just felt right. So that's the multifaceted answer for why that is the way it is.
I wanted to talk a little bit about God, like tech gods, kind of what Kaye was talking about before, and just sort of, that's like one of, I think, my favorite sci-fi, science fantasy type. I don't want to say tropes because it's not, I feel like it should be used always, like themes, and just sort of how, like, where like how you sort of drew it, how you perceived of it, and how technology and spirituality sort of meshed for you when you were writing the story.
Okay, yeah. So I'm gonna try and answer this from a number of different angles because I think it has different angles. One of them is when I started this story, what I knew was that I needed something that had gone like terribly wrong, that had created this organization that was using the remains of something terrible and powerful to create its mechs. And that evolved eventually into these highly sophisticated AIs. And the nature of them being so like fundamentally like built on theories of how human cognition works, meant that they were almost fundamentally going to be people, but they were also going to be people of immense and incredible and terrible power. So I think that's another way that this feels to me like fantasy dressed up as sci-fi, because these gods are people. they're just dudes, but like they're also not just dudes because of the incredible influence they have over the world and over other individuals. So that's an element of what I'm thinking about here. And then I think another one is that I decided really early on that I wanted there to be a religion adjacent to these entities that was not like based on them, because you will see in this book that a number of these entities have their own relationships with faith and spirituality. Like, this is a culture where broadly, like, a consequence of the multiple miniature apocalypses it suffered is like history is pretty fractured. And so there is like one syncretic religion that's fairly dominant, but it's a syncretic religion that takes for granted things like space-time as a part of its spirituality. There's like this idea that God has multiple iterations across these various instances of space-time, and there are emanations of God that are almost like these bodhisattva or avatar-esque like elements of it. And probably there are people arguing that everybody is an emanation of God, like the universe is an emanation of God. We are all different like aspects of it. And there are other people who are like, that's nonsense. There's like, you recognize an emanation of God because it's like a very specific thing. And other people would be like, an emanation of God is an experience you have. But like that's the kind of religious sentiment that is pervading in this world. And AIs also have those sentiments. there's a character that I think is going to show up in book 2 that's kind of made itself Pope, but it's made itself Pope. Like, that AI is Pope because it has deep religious beliefs, also political agendas, but like deep religious beliefs. And like, that's how I approached it. Like, simultaneously, the AIs are referred to in divine terms as gods themselves. And that's partially because, to a lot of people, in the context of this particular view of faith in the world, of course, these things are emanations of God, versus other AIs would be like, don't call me that. Like, that's not what I am, no more so than you are. Or yeah, so it's a complex, messy thing, because that felt most correct to me as a depiction of how faith would function in this context, or how I decided faith would function in this context.
So it's great that you bring up that the AIs are kind of like, they have like their own opinions about things, which I think is awesome. I wanted to touch upon like the writing style you use in this book, where you switch a lot from like third person to then second person, where the AI is either talking to us or Sunai. What kind of inspired you to write like this? I personally loved it. It did make it a little hard at points where I was like, wait, what's happening? But I think that adds to the book. I don't think it detracts from it. I saw some other people calling the book complicated. I was like, no, you just have to take your time with this one. And that's why, I think, because it switches a couple of times, but I loved that it switched a couple of times. You know what I mean? But like, what made you decide to write like that?
Instinct. It wasn't really a choice. It just kind of happened. There was a point when I realized like kind of what the storytelling opportunity was and the things that I've been experimenting with. And so the U sections became very purposeful. And because it's not like second person omniscient or like second person pervasive, or I don't know what the term is for it, when it's a second person and the you could be anybody and also the I could be anybody. It's always a very specific I and a very specific you. And that, in concert with the third person very close present, just became really useful for what I was doing with, like, because my sensibilities of how brains work are not limited to how these AIs are built and function. It's related to like all the functionally weird psychic stuff that's going on in this book. It is very intimately intertwined with my understanding of brain stuff, cognition, and how it's like sensory forward. But the interruption of language in that process is something that for me is interesting, because like when it becomes you, it's there's a coercive element to it. There's an expression of power there, which is very intentional, and like it just fits generally with the themes and problems present in the story.
Yeah, I actually really loved it. Like especially the first couple of times when you did it, when in the book, when like Sunai was like getting interrupted in the middle of like a thought. And like the AI was like apologizing to him. Like, hey, I know you're having a hard time. I'm sorry I keep doing this to you. But even he's kind of like, I don't know what's happening anymore. But like on that note too, like I saw that someone referred to him as like a disaster gay.
Yeah.
A little bit. I loved him as a character, even though he has a disaster. I think that kind of like added more humanity to him, you know?
Yeah, I just I have more fun when characters are not in control of their lives. So I think that's pretty consistent, because like I was asked something similar to this in an interview that I realized like is written, so I'm currently working on the answers to that. And I was trying to figure out like, what do I ever write a person who's like in control of themselves and what's going on with them? And I think that's probably an element of storytelling in general. Like we get characters who have competencies, but then something is out of their control. And for me, what's fun is if the thing that's out of control is like themselves and their life. There was a point pretty early on in like one of the in almost the latest draft of Archive before it was like starting to go into press, where my editor had left me a note like, this is good, this really like brings home how much of a disaster gay he is right at the front. So like, I just need you to understand that is like kind of the internal context for how we were referring to him the entire time. But yeah, no, Sunai's a mess, and I think it's funny, but I also think it's fun.
Yeah, I agree with that sentiment. I thought it was funny and fun to have exactly what you're saying, a character who's not even control of their life at all. And I think he's like, it's on purpose at first. Like he's like, yeah, I got drunk and now I'm on a ship. Like, you know?
Oh God, yeah. No, it's a deeply self-destructive impulse, which just works for me as a character. I mean, like the self-destructive and disaster impulses are deeply connected with the fact that he is in some ways indestructible. So he has a kind of death drive, a kind of like, they call it l'appel du vide, the call of the void. It's like deeply embedded in his personality. And as my wife would say, in his sexuality. But yeah, so like, this is a person who has a lot of terrible, deep existential dread feelings about the fact that he cannot die. And it is coming out in these terrible ways because he does not have any measure of internal peace. And the way that, you know, like he's expressing that is by actively seeking new ways to not be in control of himself. It's bad for him, but it's entertaining for us.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's entertaining throughout the whole thing.
Good. It's been so much fun listening to you discuss everything and just sort of, you know, your process and just how excited you are about this. When is the sequel supposed to be out, or are you just like, don't ask me that?
It's been delayed more than once, and it's my fault. Right now, like the best you could hope for would be late 2024, but more likely 2025.
That's so futuristic.
It's better to take your time with it, you know what I mean? Because like the thing you want, it'll be the best that you want it to be. You know what I mean?
I've got the opening down pat now. It's going good. Our new narrator is having a terrible time, which is how you know I'm having a good one.
Excited to read it already.
That
anytime that you can torture your original characters, right? Like that's the best way.
And now I've joked before about how like Vayati was specifically created to target my wife's Lorbo problems, and so she's having a great time because I'm like, he's I'm just gonna ruin his life.
As an author, that's what you do. Okay. Is there anything that you'd like to add about the Archive Undying before we sign off?
I don't know. I'm just really grateful anytime people seem to really click with the book, because I know it's a weird one that sits again at the junctures of a bunch of different things. So whenever someone seems a little bit bewildered by it, I'm like, yeah, that's fair. But whenever someone comes to me and is like, yes, this is like clicked with me in some way, I just feel a lot of gratitude, because it's as messy as my brain is, and I was trying to make it a nest in which my brain could live. So, you know,
that. Yeah, I like that.
If you find a home in that nest, hooray, thank you. It's a space I wanted you to have.
Like carved out a little niche on the end.
Yeah.
All
right. Well, this was wonderful. So once again, this was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. My librarian co-host was
Kaye from the Reader Services at Syosset Library.
And our absolutely awesome author guest. Who were you again?
Emma Mieko Candon. You can find me in a number of places on the internet. On Twitter, I am EMMA Candon, but basically everywhere else I am EM Candon, so EMCANDON. come find me on Tumblr. It's the best place.
Oh no, don't tell me that. We're gonna go follow you on Tumblr.
Thank you so much. And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.